First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that 1856's programming mostly takes place on the land of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. And in doing so, I'd like to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, as well as any other First Nations people listening in to us today, wherever that might be. Just as sort of a brief introduction before we get started, Marina will be presenting a synopsis of her recently published book, Speculation as a Mode of Production, Forms of Value, Subjectivity in Art and Capital, which is out by Haymarket Books. From its discussions of temporality and negation, she will attempt to outline what a speculative praxis in the current political moment could look like. So Marina is a London-based writer, editor and critic, occupied mainly with questions around art, labour and value. She teaches at the Goldsmiths University of London, which is a hot topic at the moment. Her work has appeared in journals South Atlantic Quarterly, Ephemera, After All, Journal of Cultural Economy, Australian Feminist Studies and Radical Philosophy. She is co-author with Kirsten Stegmaier of Reproducing Autonomy and Speculation as a Mode of Production, which she's talking about today. She is one of the organisers of the Centre for Philosophy and Critical Thought at Goldsmiths, a member of the Marxism and Culture Collective, and is on the board of the New Perspectives on the Critical Theory of Society series. More or less, she's also a comrade. So thank you very much, Marina, for joining us tonight and looking forward to your talk.
Okay, so wow, thank you so much, Nick, for organizing this. And it's kind of my first talk in Australia, although we are everywhere and nowhere with this platform situation. So I'm gonna talk for, I guess, about 40-45 minutes. Hopefully not longer. And yeah, like Nick said, I'm gonna start by giving a synopsis of the book. But also, the first thing is that I noticed too late, actually just now, in fact, that there's a bit of a discrepancy between the title that I provided for the talk, which Nick elaborated a little bit, and the abstract that I provided for the talk. So there'll be almost actually no discussion of temporality or loops per se in what I'm going to be talking about, which is a bit of a shame, but also illustrates how you can lose track of yourself with too many parallel processes, so to speak, to use the computing jargon. So it's more of a case of time compression than time loops in this case. So yeah, so a little bit about the book and where this research has taken me now. So yeah, Speculation of Production, subtitle Forms of Value, Subjectivity in Art and Capital, which came out at the end of 2019 in paperback and in hardback a little bit before. So the inquiry that I develop in that book reflects ongoing research into speculation as a cultural logic and a structural dynamic, as it materializes in different contexts and as different strategies which are linked by their focus on the future and their tendency to suspend the present. So in the most kind of abstract terms here. So that roughly, this focus on the future, the suspension of the present, is the time of finance. So kind of endless extension of the present, you could say, and a cancellation of the future, as others have written. In so doing, I was also trying to see what a, as it were, negativity within speculation could look like, which is to say negativity in the sense of contestation, in the sense of antagonism. And to look at negativity so as to point to a political dimension, to the kind of total sort of amorphous idealism that the term speculation or the speculative can evoke in our everyday understanding of that term in context other than the one of finance that I was just mentioning. So the reason I went with speculation as a mode of production as the title for the book is that it combines the two senses of speculation that I'm working with. So the speculative practices of art on the one hand, as a kind of ostensibly open-ended process of speculation, and financial speculation as an intensification of capital's intrinsic tendency for future-oriented growth and a kind of sealing and formatting of the present thereby. So in a kind of closed process that I've just outlined. But also on another level, finance likes to think of itself or position itself as also open-ended and creative, advertising an openness to the future and as capable of affecting and shaping the future through actions or decisions in the present, or the concept or practice of market making, as the financial advisor and theorist Eli Ayachi calls it. So both of these activities or worlds, art and finance, can be seen as deploying a reflexive approach to temporality, at least from this angle. So to sum up, what I'm suggesting in the book is that while speculative thought can be attributed to art, particularly in those critical and reflexive practices which relate to the conditions of their own production as material, and not just ones that specifically relate themselves discursively to speculation. So not just the ones interested in notions of utopia or science fiction thematically, for example, which is often how the discourse of the speculative appears in contemporary art, as well as in relation to financial tropes or imagery. So that relate to the conditions of their own production as material. And that's kind of the angle from which I'm approaching art as a speculative practice. But also more broadly, speculation can be, particularly in its economic sense, can be more broadly, or financial sense, can be more broadly defined as the self-expanding or self-valorizing dynamic of capital per se. Though it's more discernible on the ground, as I've already been mentioning, specifically in finance, or what Marx calls fictitious capital. So my approach to crafting a systematic overview of speculation takes up a type of Marxian inquiry which is known as value form analysis. And so value form meaning it approaches speculation as a social form, which shapes all kinds of patterns of social life and social relations, social reproduction, regulatory institutions in capital, rather than just the specific subset of capital called the financial industry, although I also focus on that in the book as well. So my primary interest has been how such speculation both aligns itself with this open-ended speculation I was talking about that relates to art and maybe also philosophy or thought, fictioning, but ultimately gets enclosed on other levels of the system into generating private profit. So this is the level of technical and as well as technical instruments that also function as ideological instruments, such as derivatives, government bonds, and human capital maybe being the preeminent form of the conversion of technical financial instruments into ideological and subjectifying ones. So this is the level of technical and ideological instruments, as well as the modes of intensified exploitation and extraction that reach from the scale of the planetary to the genetic, the so to speak death drive of speculation's debt drive, to collide some terrible puns. So thus speculation as a mode of production refers to the open-ended processes of art and conceptual thought, as well as the overdetermined processes of the increases of value in capitalism. So with the neoliberal era, we witness the subjective qualities of creativity, flexibility, innovation become objective factors of productivity, at least in some workplaces, and subjectivation as an entrepreneur, which is explicit, again, in some workplaces, but the precarity of conditions, which kind of sort of makes you an entrepreneur by default, is more ubiquitous across work. At the same time that objective productivity itself shifts to the indeterminacy and risk associated with creative finance and property speculation as the dominant mode of capital accumulation. So I approach this through evaluating one of the main ways in the book that I approach this is through evaluating artistic labor now as not only exceptional to, but in many ways increasingly typical of, abstract labor. And I'll say a bit more what I mean by abstract labor in a second. So more recently, I've been interested in rethinking the relationship between artistic labor and abstract labor through an examination of the impact of automation on value production. So that would imply thinking about how artistic labor mediates the social and economic shifts signaled by certain hegemonic discourses of automation. So it's definitely the case, of course, that artistic labor is not the primary concern of current automation discourses, which have traditionally been focused on labor in general, labor trends in general, and on standardized processes that can be improved, optimized, rationalized through automation. This is not the case with artistic labor, even if the fascination with factories and factory-like production processes is, of course, not unknown in the history of modern art, modernist cultures, whether plastic arts, literary, musical, or post-medial. But the goal of examining the relationship, nonetheless, between artistic labor and abstract labor through the lens of automation is to be able to offer a structural analysis, meaning the systematic conditions of social possibility for this relationship or non-relationship, as the case or the context may be, examined from a kind of mid-range of abstraction, rather than a micro-reading of particular practices on the one hand or macro-level historical accounts on the other. So again, maybe you can say a bit more about what that mid-range looks like or what it can produce a bit later. So I was saying about mediation, about how artistic labor mediates the social and economic shifts signaled by discourses of automation. So the point about mediation is important because the automation discourse, especially in its kind of more leftist variants, is concerned with value production. And art is not a value-producing activity in the traditional economic or Marxian sense. And someone like Dave Beach has written about this extensively. So rightly or wrongly, automation discourses generally presuppose that technology will lead to the obsolescence of human employment across a range of sectors, and that it can produce value without human labor, which is a kind of interesting concept in Marxian automation discourse, or contradictory concept. So we can juxtapose this emphasis on the obsolescence of employment in discourses of automation, obsolescence of human employment, with art's take on the obsolescence of labor, which has taken a variety of forms, from the kind of anti-work or pro-laziness current, all the way to the drive towards the rehearsal of labor and social usefulness in art, like just to take one example, arte utile, which edges even into the kind of para-activist or artivist niches of social practice. So when industrialism reigned, art refuted it through indolence. So we can think of someone like Mladen Stilinović's work. Or it fetishized industrialism through emulations of manual or managerial labor. So Russian constructivism, a lot of conceptual art of the 60s and 70s. Then when atomized and insecure service work started to dominate, art would try to heal social wounds or draw attention to them through protest, as well as kind of performing and rehearsing entrepreneurialism. So you can think of just a random sample of practices: Joachim Clausor, Suzanne Lacey, Carrie Young, Golden and Seneby. So the first kind of the industrial paradigm may be seen to be registering an anxiety around the value of labor, whereas the more kind of social practice paradigm is registering an anxiety around the value of art. But we could, however, look at those tendencies differently and see them as attempts to figure value in a non- or post-capitalist sense, and to use the imaginative and economic resources of the art institution to do so. So looking at it that way can allow us to call into question the claims of automation discourses, which share some common assumptions but can be otherwise heterogeneous. Question the claims of automation discourses by refocusing the gaze on a stagnating rather than accelerating or accelerated economy, where technology, instead of eliminating jobs, lowers wages and degrades working conditions for the majority. We can thus try to see how the politics of labor, rather than the theme of labor, however expansively that can be understood, can emerge as a key way that the art field is able to potentially contribute to developing forms of social life that move away from both the homogenizing drive of abstract labor and the accompanying, strictly tethered, you could say, forms of exceptionalism associated with artistic labor. But first, what is being referred to in the invocation of value, value relations, value producing, and in the kinds of labor that these may or may not be proximate to? So I begin by distinguishing the kind of labor that goes on in the space of art, foremost, but not exclusively by any means, the labor of producing artworks, or instances of art, and what can be understood by labor in general in a capitalist society. So concretely, this means the distinction between artistic labor and abstract labor, as I've already said, which is essential to tracking how the automation discourse encounters a different object in these two domains when we're talking about labor. So the notion of labor here, as already noted, derives from the Marxist critique of political economy, along with the processes of accumulation and subjectivity formation outlined in that tradition. So value producing labor is what allows capital to expand and reproduce itself. That is abstract labor, not any specific or concrete labor that may be performed for a financial return, but the way that all labor in a capitalist society appears to be a free exchange of time and labor power for a wage, with that power sold as a commodity whose rate is set in and by a buyer's market. So the keystone of the relation of abstract labor to value is that the source of value for capital is the differential between how much value a worker can produce in a certain time and the wage that they receive for that time. So that differential is usually referred to as surplus value. So much of this finds additional complexity in the fractured landscape of digitally administered precarity of the gig economy and human capital, where the wage dissolves into a variety of uncertain, fragmented income streams and hustles, as they call them. Still, abstract labor is a form in the social ontology of capitalist society, which, along with other forms that characterize that society, such as private property, rent, and even, for some theorists, race and gender, which may have a specific appearance and a specific kind of denaturalized naturalness in capitalist society, allows us to grasp the regularities of specific social relationships insofar as they are mediated by money and the access to resources enabled by the possession of money. So the rendering equivalent of commodities by money and the brutal decontextualization of concrete lives, conditions, and labors by this equivalence is what is meant by abstract labor as a dominant social form in capitalist society. At the level of an analysis that encompasses social form in this way, all wage-earning labor in a capitalist society unfolds in the form of abstract labor, But not all wage labor is value producing, and not all labor is exchanged for a wage. Because now, just as when Marx was first elaborating these theories, vast proportions of labor relationships are informal, coerced, and not recognized as labor, and also are not exclusively performed by agents recognized as humans. So where does artistic labor sit in this landscape? In one sense, you could say the answer is simple. It doesn't sit in it at all. Artistic labor does not help to expand capital, nor is it rationalized or waged. It is not value producing. It cannot be reorganized by different managerial techniques or technologies. There is no one to control the process besides its maker. It produces often without any concept of a market, and when marketable commodities are produced, they are collected or exchanged as status goods with disposable income, not with capital that would be invested in an assembly process in order to expand production and increase profits. In another sense, however, the answer is more nuanced than that, because the exceptional qualities of artistic labor don't actually put it outside value relations, even if they do put it outside, in most cases, value production. So value production, of course, is just one aspect of value relations that reproduce capital as a social form on every imaginable scale, from algorithmic trades to our everyday activities, implanting efficiency and accounting metrics at every level of our lives. If we focus on the broader and more diffuse field of value relations then, the automation discourse appears to have some bearing on artistic labor, insofar as it shapes subjectivities and power relations and provides materials, techniques, and indeed platforms of representation. But of course, as I've already been hinting, the problem in relating discourses about the inexorable spread, or the kind of teleology of automation, the inexorable spread of automation to artistic labor, that problem is linked to the fact that these discourses are meant to address the regularities of tasks required for the manufacturing of this or that product. The drive for standardization is the trajectory of the cyborg that observers from Marx all the way up to Donna Haraway and beyond have written about. Its telos is the mechanization of functions previously performed by human workers and the corresponding transfer of agency from the worker to the manager, and eventually to the obscured agency of the programmers of intelligent algorithms in robotic and other automated technologies. The elimination of eccentricity or willfulness is integral to this process. Here, the control and optimization of labor is central. Artistic labor, on the other hand, has nothing routine or regular about it, at least from the standpoint of comparing it to industrial process in the labor market. Another way of automating the standard package of tasks, of course, is more frequently encountered in the field of consumption. The washing machine, the robot Hoover, the self-driving car, and so forth. So the types of automation discussed here can be distinguished as labor controlling and labor saving, although in practice these are more moments in a continuum than a kind of hard and fast distinction between them. So this is a relatively conventional story of automation as a force in the capitalist economy. It focuses on the growing efficiency of technology as an irresistible force in a competitive market that culminates in a crowding out of human labor. I mean, it's a story that's been told for a century, if not more, maybe since industrialization, in fact. The concepts at the center of this story, efficiency, optimization, and improvement, progress, in other words, overlook the fact that capitalism's tendency is to produce exception rather than regularity, waste rather than efficiency, and destruction rather than optimal ways of life as part of its normal functioning. As we can see from the phenomena that dominate this current moment and our age more generally, global heating, viral pandemics, racialized violence and expropriation, and mass extinction of species. So the tenets of the automation discourse then are essentially progressive ones, And in this, they mirror the assumed path of scientific knowledge in teleologies, ideologies of modernity, Western modernity. Greater clarification about the workings of the world obtained through greater computing power. So this dynamic of optimization is extended directly in the automation discourse to the social, political, and economic, as if scientific practice could be translated into these registers unproblematically, and as if the neutrality of science was a given rather than a highly contested premise. And you encounter this a lot as well in kind of technocratic discourses of kind of eco-modernism or planetary geoengineering, which tend to be given more than expected prominence in the sphere of cultural theory. Even in more critically inflected versions of the automation discourse, there's an unexamined assumption that technology develops in a relatively linear fashion, and its destiny is to replace humans. Only in the kind of critically inflected version of the discourse, the landscape in which that transpires might look a little bit more dystopian. But it's going to happen anyway, is the argument. Although the more recent cultural drift among critical voices in the automation discourse has actually been more positive. So ones like the notions of fully automated luxury communism. And there, the faith in optimization shared with Silicon Valley kinds of positions and stances is much more obvious. So we see that the automation discourse conflates the valorization of capital and the development of technology as if they're the same thing. And this is a key misunderstanding because the two actually frequently diverge. One reason for this divergence is that in a profit-driven mode of production, technologies are only developed and commercialized if they are seen to be potentially profitable. If employing workers costs less than installing new, more efficient technology, then the technology will not be installed, which explains why the world is much less mechanized by now than it could be, under another, supposedly more rational, perhaps, mode of production. The important point, at least for the purposes of this discussion, is that automation is not what is leading to higher productivity and more redundancy of employment. The situation we are facing is not really one of mass unemployment, as predicted by automation theorists, but of escalating underemployment, as writers like Aaron Benanav and Jason Smith discuss. And escalating underemployment is something that ruling classes are quite comfortable with, as long as growth holds in the key parts of the structure: policing, military, and resource extraction, across all kinds of fields. So this is not a crisis to be managed by the introduction of neutral policy instruments such as the universal basic income, at least not as a panacea, or as a kind of horizon of demand, maybe as a specific tool in some cases, but by movements to abolish private property, along with the scarcity and violence that it generates. In the current moment, for example, there's at least hypothetically more space for the recognition that the health emergency is both a product of and is intensified by the social emergency, that there is a social emergency. A recognition that is creating legitimacy for other horizons of the possible in the widening abysses of the actual. However, even if the automation discourse is empirically misguided, the desire of many of its proponents to look beyond the social and economic realities of the current mode of production is something that's obviously worth holding on to. So that I want to conclude now by looking at the role that artistic labor can play in this kind of envisaging. So there's two main hypotheses there. The first is that artistic labor is, and will continue to be, principally unaffected by automation because it is not value-producing labor. Technology cannot replace art's production and distribution processes, even if the fabrication of artworks is sometimes outsourced and thus is affected by many kinds of automated technologies. But art does entertain a critical proximity to automation that is kind of analogous to its proximity to finance. In the case of finance, it is art's existence as an investment good, setting aside kind of conceptual or critical proximities or relations. In the case of automation, it's more the fluctuation of the critical currency of technologies and art's discursive production, such as the relatively recent example of blockchain as a trope in contemporary art. Judging from how these themes emerged, there's a recurrent idea of alternative economies or self-sufficiency, which is quite legible in the objective conditions, which is quite legible as triggered or kind of readable, obviously, readable from the objective conditions of dwindling funding, rising debt, both education and consumer debt, and precarious labor prospects for artists, creative technologists, and other cultural workers. The theme of automation can thus seem like a pivotal means for staging social critiques of labor in the field of art by sketching out different infrastructures of economic reality. But also, on the other hand, it can sideline the self-determination of labor or the organization of labor for the more conservative utopian impulse of an optimal techno-future, as I mentioned earlier, from the side of discourses in cultural theory. In this, it echoes the distortions of the automation discourse more broadly, such as the techno-determinism, which overlooks the historical, social, and systemic frictions that refute the tenacious dream in all automation discourses for the last couple of centuries of labor's replacement by machines as something which is inevitable and inscribed into capitalism as a progressive rather than a stagnant and destructive force. Now, the second hypothesis is a little bit more involved. So here I'll be calling, at least initially, on Adorno's argument that art both reflects and rejects the forces of production of its era, which can lead us to ask if we're living in an era of economic stagnation, an era when the resurgence of violence and direct extraction are the engines of accumulation, centrally the engines of accumulation, obviously so, although they always have been. How can artistic labor deploy its own practical or institutional exceptionality deliberately as a form of social praxis, rather than continually tracing the stakes of its institutional complicity to those engines and the ways it mediates them or distances itself from them? So, and if it doesn't do that, are we also looking at a kind of stagnant, symbolic, and conceptual economy in art? Or perhaps we could suggest that the speculative force, speculative as in inventive and open-ended, the speculative force of labor politics in the field of art could have that impact of setting it apart from a trend towards stagnation, rather than the transformation of artistic labor per se. And so labor politics here taken in the sense of non-art, in the sense of organizational form, but also as posing as a kind of force of negation or a kind of challenge, a kind of foreign matter in the field of art as a detached and autonomous activity. So a transversal current that links up with social movements not strictly in the field of art, but where movements in the field of art can link with social movements not strictly in the field of art, and where their formation is transversal rather than separate than coalitional, could be capable of pushing art further, both conceptually and politically. Such a push would rely on art's powers, its speculative powers, of infrastructural critique, which is to say critique that starts making other spaces and structures for practice, even as it diagnoses the problems with existing ones. While this can take the shape of labor politics for artists and art workers, so projects such as Wage, or the unionization drives for institutional staff and art handlers across the US, years, and especially in the last year, or new grassroots unions for precarious cultural workers, as in the UK. I'm sure there's examples in the space you're located in Australia, and more widely. The labor politic, or the labor politics of focusing on the labor politics, exposing the labor politics of global museum franchises, such as Gulf Labor Group. And also, at its most incisive, this approach can go sort of 360 degrees, moving from labor politics to the total or historical value relations involved, as with the work of Cameron Rowland, for example, who I've written on recently, on property regimes in humans and property regimes in art, and how these can be materially linked and elaborated in an indefinite temporality, not just the temporality of the work or the exhibition. So more precisely on this point of speculation and negation as something artistic practice can push and artistic institutions can amplify or platform. Writers such as George Kofensis or Chris Arthur have argued that the productive force of errancy in labor cannot be overlooked. And so I'm interested in looking at it in terms of artistic labor here. So errancy, here meaning the creative power of refusal, the possibility of saying no or doing otherwise, that demarcates the space of freedom within a relation of exploitation, or a margin of freedom within a relation of exploitation. According to Kofensis, it is because, not in spite of, because the worker is creative and does more, has to do more than just follow instructions, that any labor process is successful. So surplus value here is not just the result of the objective gap between the value produced and the value the workers receive through their wages. It is also the extra value that becomes expected and taken for granted as an outcome of individual creativity or initiative and the powers of cooperation between many individuals, which amplifies this creativity. So then this creativity can become the ability to envision another situation where it is not subjugated to work discipline and the value imperative, or trying to survive within it, and other relations can become both imaginable and practicable. So this can be seen as the creativity of negation, or in other terms, the creativity of that non-identity between worker and value that the capitalist is constantly trying to both profit from and erase. So through the concept of counterproductive labor, Arthur sees the antagonism of the labor-capital relation as internal to the very performance of labor, as a regular aspect of labor, rather than as unfolding in the space of a labor struggle or in the adjudication of conflicting interests in the political sphere. So this imbrication of creativity with negation pushes capital away from labor and towards machines and software as the generators of profit, or as kind of looking to them to generate profit. Capital, or as Marx calls it, the automatic subject, is always striving to reduce the presence of errancy and the potential of error or destruction, the unpredictability of the human working subject, in the ratio to the ideally fully controllable presence of the object, the commodity, the machine. No wonder there is so much hope pinned to the trope of human capital, which tries to seal the non-identity between human and capital under the sign of aspiration, of success, of self-management. So finally, for artistic labor, this negation can be seen as perhaps doubled. Its place in value relations, artistic labor's place in value relations, so long as we're looking at labor specifically in art and not at artistic commodities, its place in value relations is to negate value production, or at least operate at a distance from it. So artistic labor at the level of social form, as well as at the level of its institutional and economic content. It is estranged from value production. It cannot be standardized, and every conservative implication of its separation, so conservative implications as perhaps enshrined in the kind of faded theology of artistic autonomy, which is discredited critically but continues to be enforced structurally. Every conservative implication of the separation from value production at the same time is capable of being radicalized precisely as refusal, as Adorno wrote, again, more than half a century ago. So this detachment is also a space of access to resources, discursive, material, and political, that enable other forms of social negation and political invention. So I would say maybe this is the sense of the socially speculative that I'd be developing, the conjunction of social negation and political invention, that enable other forms of these to be modeled or practiced under the aegis of art and in concord with other movements in society, with other oppositional movements. As Max Haven recently wrote, the imbrication of artists and institutions with wider movements for the abolition of the wage, property, race, and gender, at least on their far horizon, might also entail the abolition of the artist as what he calls an economic figure. So the creative dimension of negation, tendentially implicit in all labor, as I've just been outlining, but institutionally sanctified only in artistic labor, normative only for artistic labor, might prove to be the generative point of conjunction between artistic practices and those movements, especially in a time when biological life is directly threatened by the prospect of the form which it takes in our societies, continuing unabated and unnegated. So that's kind of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Clap, 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 clap. I'm going to open it up to everyone for comments and questions. Feel free, maybe just write your name in the chat, and then I can assign who speaks first. So I'll keep an eye on that. But maybe to kick it off, I wanted to ask you a question, or maybe just to elaborate a little bit on, let's say, the site of the university in terms of artistic labor and how that relates to something like the production of intellectual property. Since, we are in a situation, especially in Australia, where most established artists work in the university sector, which is very much like the British model. And whether you could sort of talk about that. I have your paper in front of me, The Hard Labour of Speculation. I think that's a nice part here. I'll just read it out for everyone else. Where you're talking about the development of conceptualism alongside this mode of thought, as in speculation, and you say conceptualism more or less reflects and anticipates a transition in capitalism from an economy centered on the industrial production of commodities to an economy centered on the control of intellectual property, which is very much reflected in how art schools have become part of the university sector, part of the production of intellectual property, as opposed to trade schools like they were before. So I'm not sure if you have anything to elaborate there in the position of the university in terms of this.
Well, I guess the university being, in a way, positioning itself as a kind of hub and clearinghouse for intellectual property claims and the development of intellectual property. So obviously, if you have artists are brought into the university so that the university can benefit from perhaps not a kind of direct or legal claim to intellectual property, but from the brand that they bring to the university, right? So there's a kind of more informal, social, but very much kind of increasingly codified through things like metrics, research assessment in the UK context. Different moments of codification and sort of, as William Clare Roberts calls it, imaginary subsumption of the practice or the individual as a brand, which can reproduce value in different contexts, with the university being a kind of main one. So you've got the profiting from the labor, from the teaching, and profiting from the extra university activity, which then is kind of recuperated into the university's branding or university's claims to identifying with those practices in various mediated ways. So, I mean, that all sounds a little bit blurry, but I guess what I'm thinking about here is that the process of valorization is extremely speculative and extremely indeterminate as well. Just like the kinds of practices that are kind of sometimes codified and sometimes just left to kind of be an atmosphere which can be pulled into the brand at various points, kind of acupuncturally. So you mentioned at the beginning the kind of Goldsmith's context, and of course you can see an example of that with kind of the various forms of brand damage, I guess, that political activity and kind of disclosure and exposure of how those like the violence of those relations actually works, as with the Evan Ifekoya's withdrawal of their labor. That is kind of maybe just sort of putting a name to that process of extraction, right? And how it continues to be racialized, gendered and subordinating, even within this kind of amorphous self-branding prestige economy of bringing the kind of artistic brand to operate. Those artistic brands are not administered or governed equally, so to speak. So that's the kind of embodiment of the speculative control of intellectual property, which becomes again control over labor. So then those come back into connection institutionally through processes of institutional governance, extraction, and the violence of those processes.
Giles has a question, I think, on this topic as well. Giles, you there?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hi, hi Marina. Thanks for the wonderful discussion. I was a little bit late, so I missed the beginning. But my question, I think, follows just from the point you just made about the relationship to, say, the Goldsmiths or the crisis, I suppose, there at the moment, and how that's sort of unfolding. Like watching it from Australia, we have similar sort of issues, obviously, in the universities here and in the art schools. And my thinking about it in relation to your answer to the first question about speculation is, what is the relationship between the speculative and like spectacle in this case? Because it seems to me that like the damage to, say, Goldsmith's reputation, perhaps for allowing this to sort of fester and then to finally reach boiling point, you know, it brings it into the, you know, to worldwide attention, and I wonder whether it sort of like has some sort of relationship to, you know, the fact, even if it's bad news, it's still good for the university because it's still getting this kind of like attentional economy that you know, means it reaches a wider audience. People have an opinion about whether they, you know, think the actions of the artists and academics are the right actions, or, you know, and people are talking about Goldsmiths maybe all around the world. Is there a relationship between, say, the sort of spectacle innovation? I mean, even etymologically, there's a relationship, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's a really useful question. I mean, spectacle and speculation, obviously you've been kind of pointing to this idea of like, there's no such thing as bad publicity. All publicity is good publicity, even when it's disclosing really horrendous things. So that's also kind of interesting in the sense that in the current dispensation of a place like Goldsmiths, and again, this may be the case in some of the Australian institutions you were thinking of, it's an extremely authoritarian managerial situation. So actually the only way labor can become visible is through spectacle of this kind, through brand damage, through bad publicity, because there's the negotiation processes that kind of, you know, traditional union negotiation processes really don't function anymore, right? So it's only kind of denunciation as well as sort of like withdrawal, refusal, blockage that can operate there. And these are processes which are by default more about visibility than they are about kind of negotiation, mediation happening behind the scenes, which is maybe how a lot of these organs are used to working and now find themselves without any tools unless besides spectacle in a way. So I guess where that connects to the speculative is, again, you have this kind of brand building. You have to engage in brand building to destroy another brand. So that's the kind of how labor antagonism gets displaced into an economy of attention and an economy of kind of antagonism played out on social media platforms, which then can perhaps have repercussions on the material conditions that drive those antagonisms, at least in the case of Goldsmiths, where kind of we've had fairly effective social media campaigns starting from the anti-racist occupation last year to the wildcat marking boycott to Evans action. So yeah, there's a kind of the speculative and the spectacle seem to be providing the parameters for a form of kind of public and labor antagonism, which has no more recourse to kind of traditional organs of mediation. Maybe that's one thing that you could really say the Goldsmiths situation is just exemplary of. It's obviously not specific to Goldsmiths.
And just to follow up on that then, do you feel like if there is this relationship or these parameters between spectacle and speculation, as you just mentioned, the sort of redundancy maybe of like organized labor or unions in this space, for example, is that something you can see being kind of recuperated by like the union movement, or like how that could sort of like re-engage with these kind of formally, I suppose, like, yeah, I mean, the ways of engaging with the activism is sort of not very kind of clearly related to former organizing models for like, you know, for union action or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a problem for the kind of organized labor for the union movement, you know, for decades, right? That they've been kind of rendered irrelevant by the way labor conditions have been broken down and have been reconfigured by capital, and as mediating organs by kind of the pathways of negotiation that they have become used to no longer being open to them, and perhaps negotiation becoming discredited due to the kind of severity of inequality and the kind of degradation of life and living and working conditions overall. So this has kind of resonated in, maybe this is resonating maybe late in with the university unions, but which is also kind of interesting because probably Australia as well, but UK compared to Europe has this kind of huge central union for academics, which there isn't, for example, example, my friends in Germany belong to some kind of civil servants union that does not take action, is not a kind of workers union. So there's a kind of like proletarianization which comes with organization in the UK context, which is maybe in some ways specific, not maybe compared to other Anglophone settler environments, but maybe in Europe. So the kind of need for adopting other tactics and the need for acknowledging the kind of radicalization of the conflict is, I think, coming to an organization like the UCU, probably like many unions, decades too late, and is maybe just kind of, and it's reactive. It's kind of responses to a crisis situation, which is also partially driven by those responses in the case of state and university management of it. So I think maybe I've lost the focus of my answer, but I think it's, yeah, that reinvention is that needed reinvention of the union organisms is extremely patchy and intermittent and very kind of grassroots. It's not happening in the union as a whole. It's maybe happening in goldsmiths because there's a kind of, and this maybe connects to spectacle and the speculative. It's like everyone expects goldsmiths to kind of organize, to kind of be out in this sort of vanguard of pushing back, just like they expect goldsmiths to be radical and not racist, whereas actually it's almost like the extremity of the terrible things that happen at goldsmiths are a factor of how well organized it is in bringing that to public attention. Because I mean, obviously there may be things like this, things like the ones that are being discussed in terms of obviously structural racism, intense casualization is in many other institutions. It's just goldsmiths has enough access to kind of spectacular modes of drawing attention to them, you could say, and the speculative politics perhaps entailed, as well as kind of the involvement of academics, particularly junior academics, in organizing with cleaners and other workers on campus and really connecting that to the kind of cultural infrastructure of goldsmiths. That's another maybe preliminary to what's happening now. So yeah, it's almost like, so the kind of level of exposure and the level of kind of, I guess, dreadfulness that kind of comes to light as a result is almost more like a testament to a success of organizing, you could say, which is maybe connects to the relationship between the speculative and spectacle a bit.
Thanks. I think that actually really nicely sort of draws that link out in your paper, I guess, about that negative power of, or critical power of the work of art, and the critical power of union organizing as well. Obviously a part of the Venn diagram here that 1850 is interested in. And that sort of creative power of refusal, which is so summed up by the strike. And for everyone else who's listening, Australians will recall the green bands that saved many heritage buildings in the 80s through strike. And you know, at the moment in Sydney, there's a green band happening where they're saving some cultural architecture, you know, from demolition. So again, this, you know, also there's a sort of act of refusal that produces, of course, then another kind of cultural moment. But I just want to pass it over to Danny Butt. He had a question that would be great to hear from him. Unless you want me to read it out, Danny.
Thanks. Hi, Marina. Thank you for the very useful summary. So as I mentioned, I've almost finished the book. and it's been very transformative, and really appreciate you sharing the analysis with us. So if I just want to, if I heard you correctly in your talk, you discussed, I put the question in the chat so that you can probably read, but it's, but I guess the question about a sense of detachment and how this might connect to, I guess, a bourgeois space of detachment that has been sort of authorized for art, particularly in the way that state-sponsored institutions in the West have created, you know, I guess galleries, various kinds of forms of art education and instruction as a kind of trajectory of culturalization towards the middle classness. And so therefore, I think a certain kind of detachment from the mass body is always the goal of that in some way from the state, or has been historically. And we might be moving into a new kind of space now as those institutions are being financialized. So I just wondered if you could sort of elaborate on how on this space of reserve or detachment and the possibility that it offers in relationship to perhaps maybe problems of vanguardism, or the space of the, you know, the romantically privileged artist or poet who thinks on behalf of, is able to think on behalf of the people, and how that might be changing in the current political economic mode that you diagnose at the moment of sort of financialization.
Yeah, no, that's, I'll try and kind of, let's think complexly enough for that question on my feet. And then I would really like to maybe actually come back to you, because you on your own and in conjunction with Rachel O'Reilly have written so kind of deeply and fascinatingly about the kinds of contemporary predicament of artistic autonomy in relation to the boycott and other kind of contexts. So I might come back to you at the end. But I guess, so the first kind of gesture that was kind of quite sort of maybe schematic was just to kind of see, well, with the changing, with this kind of distance, let's look at this distance as primarily a kind of economic and organizational distance. And what forms of subjectivity does this kind of economic and organizational distance, or rather kind of obliqueness, kind of oblique angle rather than distance maybe, what can it produce in the sense of kind of distance from economic value becoming more and more a common predicament for more and more people. So there you have this kind of, but the problematic is exactly as you say, that art is still a space of like class formation and class subjectivity formation, particularly the kind of idealization of the individual and the kind of the creativity of the individual, which has in the current moment really specific kind of political implications, quite sort of like right wing and even kind of far right implications, as writers like Anna Teixeira Pinto, Kirsten Stackemeyer, and others have described. And those kind of campaigns that have been happening around sort of various kind of very sporadic, thankfully, far right spaces in the contemporary art institutional landscape also show that the kind of valorization of the unique individual can have particular kind of reactionary, generally reactionary political consequences in the current moment. But so I guess the kind of interesting question, I think, for me is what distinguishes the current moment in its ability to kind of project transversal coalitions or associations between activism in the field of art and activism outside the field of art, in like boycotts or kind of movements like decolonize, displace, against the police violence, display like ecological, sort of racial, ecological, cultural destruction, like pipeline protests and other kind of so many proliferating movements. How is this moment different from kind of like modernist or previous kind of 1920s, 30s sort of like popular front kind of moments where the artist identified as a worker or identified as a citizen or identified as an activist? What is different about the current moment of accumulation and the current political moment from that moment, which means that the kind of stakes for transversal organizing between workers or kind of subjects in the field of art and culture and those that kind of may come into that field for a particular, use it as a platform or use it as a space of visibility or spectacle. What makes these two historical moments different, and what that means for the strategies of organizing that can be or should be adopted, as well as what kinds of subjectivities can be produced in those processes of organizing, meaning that the kind of class subjectivities produced in the space of art have to undergo some kind of torsion, not just in the realization of a kind of common precarity, but in processes of organizing. So maybe that's kind of where I would leave it, because I want to kind of put the question back to you.
Thanks, Marina.
Thank you. So Danny, you don't want to say anything about autonomy? I would love for you to say something.
No. I think yeah, no, I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to disrupt the very careful elaboration we've had today with an off the cuff remarks, I think. But yeah. But just to maybe say that, yeah, thank you for just, I guess, linking it to the, the current moment seems very live. And so I think the analysis of the ability to make what you call the transversal relationship does seem to be operating in some new form that is not how it exactly was even 10 years ago.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And racialization would be one key term that we would use to that I think we can all understand as a very important kind of question for us all.
Yeah.
Unless there's any other final questions, we might wrap up due to it being over an hour already. But again, thank you so much, Marina. Thank you everyone for coming. If you're not part of your union already, you have to join. That's always my message. And next week, please join us for the next part of the series, which is Ted Gott, curator at the National Gallery of Victoria, speaking about artistic labour during the AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s, which I'm really fascinated to hear from Ted about that, who was actually in the US when it broke. So I think I'll be really curious. So please join us next week, and thanks again to Marina. Everyone is saying thank you in the chat.
Thank you.